Hi, my name is Alex Riviere. I am a senior Vue developer for Next Technologies, and I make cursed things. So today we're going to talk about how to define props in Vue.js. Now, you might be thinking, I know how to do that. Do you? Because I've come up with 20 different ways to do it. If you can't count 20 different ways of doing it, then you don't. There are a lot of different ways of doing this. Now, when I say we are going from the mundane to the deranged, I would like to point out some quotes from some members of our audience about myself. Homer graciously gave me this beautiful compliment one time. Did you see what this jackwagon did? I don't specifically remember what it was about, but I'm sure it was well-deserved. So when we talk about doing things in a deranged way, just understand, when I tell you that the thing I'm doing is deranged, don't ever do it. So let's get started talking about props. So props in Vue are the way that we pass reactive data from a parent component into a child component. There are many ways of doing this outside of props, but props is sort of the standard go-to first approach that you should be doing for most things. The generic prop definition that is the first example in the Vue documentation that everybody has probably, hopefully, maybe seen, preferably not used in production, is this. You can, in your Vue component, you will export an object, right? It's our default object, right? Because we're in single file component land, so you always do an export default. And we define a props property, and then you can pass in an array of strings. Each of these strings is the name of the prop that you want. There is no type safety, there is no type definition. You're just saying, when you see these things, those are props. That's it. That's the whole generic prop definition. This is a very straightforward, basic way of defining props. This is great. This is good. Good for prototyping when you're like, I'm not entirely sure what this data is going to be, so let's just toss something in there and roll with it. Pointing it out, right? The one prop I would like to point out here is model value. Now, model value is the name of a specific prop in Vue.js. It is the default way that we are able to use vmodel, the vmodel directive, which allows two-way binding. In order to get that two-way binding to work with vmodel, you would also need to define an emits of update model value, update model value. But I wanted to single out that if you just do a props array with a string of model value, then you're halfway there to having your vmodel stuff set up. So this will work with vmodel as long as you also define a way of updating that prop. Great. Now, like I said, this is generic. This is very simple. This is not something that you should be doing in production, right? In production, we want to be able to tell people like, hey, we need to be able to have what type of thing the prop is. So now we need to add some types to stuff, right? So the next way to define props is that we can add some types to them. So let's do that. So this is the same example, right? We have our props thing on an object. It's going to have 3 values. Our model value can be either a string or a number. So now, if we get an object for model value, during dev, when we're trying stuff out and you put an object in there, the Vue system will go, this is not the right type of thing for this prop, and it'll tell you. It won't do that in production, but it will tell you while you're doing development stuff. Similarly, we have name as a string and we have options as an object. So we're now sort of getting into the like, how are things supposed to look, right? We're able to sort of give hints to other developers. None of this actually does anything during production. This doesn't stop anybody from passing an object to model value. This doesn't stop anybody from putting a number into the name prop, right? It doesn't actually block anything. It just gives you better developer experience. Right, model value. I did a bunch of highlighting on all of this, and then I've been ignoring my notes. Great, okay. So from here, typically, we also need to say, hey, some of these are required, some of these are not. right? So to do that, we go into a slightly different format. We still have our types, but we've moved it into an object definition. So we have type with the type of thing that it is. For model value, we now have a new property called required true. So once again, this does not stop anything in production. If you don't provide something in production, it'll still attempt to render everything. So this doesn't actually block, this doesn't like cause the entire system to error out. You attempting to access that prop and then access a property of that prop or whatever will cause the system to error out. This is just a good developer hint to say, hey, this one is required, so make sure that you're providing something for it, because it's going to be undefined otherwise. Similarly, with name, we have a string, and with this one, this is not required. And in order to make sure that we gracefully handle this being not required, we have a default property. Now, the default property does do stuff in production. This is one of the properties that does actually do something in production. This will provide a default value for your prop in production. So this is one that's actually really useful. If you're not using default, if you didn't know about default, start using default. Also, with options, because it's of type object, you can't just say the default is an object, because then every instance of that component will share that object reference, right? Because JavaScript is weird. So when you're dealing with objects, arrays, anything that's more complex than a primitive value like a string, a number, Boolean, I feel like there's another one in there, but I can't remember. You need to provide a function as your default that will return the default value. So in our case, we're providing a function. It returns an empty object. Cool? Makes sense? Everybody following so far? Great. All right. So make sure that you have that default function there. Now, the other thing that I would like to point out is that I have the default for name, but it doesn't have to be just a string. You can also provide a function that will return a default value for primitive values as well. This allows you to do potentially calculations at the time that the component is started up. Inside of this function, you don't have access to the state of, you don't have any of the refs or anything that you're defining, right? You only have access to things that exist outside of the component. So you could do date math inside of this to return the current timestamp as a number or what have you. But we can use a constructor function here as well to define a default. Cool. Default, yay, good job. Okay. Now, the last function that we have that I'm going to throw in here is we have this object, right? We have this object that is our default object, but what if we need to have an object of a specific shape? We want to be able to give a developer a hint about the fact that that object needs to be a specific shape. We have a lovely thing called a validator function. You can write a custom validator for your prop definition. And what this does is that it gives you the current value that's being passed in. It also gives you all the props. So if you need to be like, hey, based on these other props, this thing should be an array. Based on these other props, this thing should be a single value, right? For instance, you have a select dropdown that you're building. You have a toggle for multiple, right? That input value, that model value, that should really be an array of options, as opposed to when it's not multiple, it should be a single value. It should be a string, it should be a number, whatever, right? You can do that inside of this validator and say, and throw an error or whatever. The validator, once again, I do not believe it actually does anything in production. It does get compiled into your bundle, but it does not actually do anything unless you specifically make it throw an error or something like that. So it will get run in production, but it won't give you any developer hints or anything like that in production that way. So these are sort of all of the things that we can do. The last one is, let's say that we want to make options have a default, but also it can be undefined. You can use null within an array as your type, And that will allow you to say, this is undefined. And that is an allowable option for this prop. And that will inform Vue, hey, if you see undefined, that's acceptable. Don't get angry about that. Undefined or null. So those are sort of all of these things. We talked about the validator, which is great. Cool. Where am I going next? Yeah. So some of you at this point are like, cool. So this gives me type safety in TypeScript, right? Like we've defined things. Not quite. We got to do a little bit of an extra step with this type of definition in TypeScript. So what this looks like in TypeScript, sort of extra little bit that we need to do here, is that we're going to import a type called prop type from Vue. And then we can define a type. So like we have our options type now. And I've removed model value and name. Those are still there. I'm just, for the sake of this demo, I couldn't fit it all on the screen. We now have type object or null, right, in parentheses. We're saying that is going to be a prop type. So as prop type, options or null. And that gives us the ability to get that type safety in TypeScript. You can actually say, this is the specific type. So if you have a string that only has certain values that it can be, in TypeScript, you can pass in like a union type to say prop type, union type, right? And so you'll always need to make sure that you have language TS in your script tag if you're doing this in a single file component, right? Because we need TypeScript engine to be kicking in for all of this stuff. We want to import that prop type, and then we also want to find the type of the thing that we want, and then we can say as prop type is the magic way of giving you type safety, and the Vue TypeScript engine stuff will then figure out like, oh, you're actually passing a thing that's either a string, an object, or null, and you can't do that, so make sure that it's an object before it gets that right. Like it'll take care of all of that for you. Great. Now, up to this point, except for this example, everything that I have shown you can be done at runtime. So we can, one of the beautiful things about Vue, that I love about Vue, and I usually start off my talks when I'm talking about intro to Vue, about Vue, is that it can run in the browser without a build step. That is one of the features of Vue. You can just script tag in your HTML, import Vue, define a bunch of components, and the template compiler you can make sure that you get the version that has the template compiler, and you bring it in, and it'll do all the things. It'll work just like you're expecting it to. So everything that I've shown you up to this point works in the browser, except for this. This doesn't work because it's TypeScript, so ignore this one. But everything else that I've shown you so far works in the browser. You do not need a build step to be able to use it. So going forward, we need a build step. So I want to talk about runtime versus build time and make sure that we're all on the same page about the difference between runtime versus build time, because we're going to get into some shenanigans in a minute. So runtime versus build time. In runtime, everything is interpreted in the browser, right? So it has to be something that works inside the browser in order for it to work. It cannot require a build step. It can be used by any JavaScript interpreter loosely, right? Like, so we have Deno, we have Node. Theoretically, anything that we're doing should work in there as long as the appropriate APIs are available. And once again, it does not require a build step. You just type that sort of stuff straight into a script tag in an HTML file. The browser will run it. So when I'm talking about stuff at runtime, I am talking about anything that would work in the browser without compilation. So when we talk about build time, this is your build step. This is when you type in, npm run build. This is the thing. That is the process we're talking about here when we're talking about build step. And it can be, so part of why I'm saying this is that there are things called compiler macros, which we're going to get into. Compiler macros are a thing that run at build time and create runtime code, okay? So it is an instruction to the Vue compiler, to Vite, to Webpack, to whatever, saying, hey, here's a thing I want to do. I'm going to put some code here. You figure out where it goes. You figure out how it needs to be defined, right? That code that is a compiler macro will not work outside of the build step. This is very important, because if you try to use the things I'm about to show you in the browser, it's not going to work because it's designed for a compiler. All right? Does everybody follow this? Does everybody understand the difference between build time and runtime? Do I need to go over anything? All right, cool. Good. Let's talk about single file component magic, as I like to call it. And this magic is achieved with a beautiful new way of writing components, and it's called script setup. Who here has done script setup components? Cool. All right. So as I showed before, right, most of the time when you're writing a single file component, you're going to have like a script tag. You're going to do export default with an object. And then when you're writing a composition component, right, rather than an options-based one, when you're writing a composition component, you would make a setup function, and you would do stuff in the setup function, and you would return all the things that you want available in the template, right? What script setup does is that it's like, how about this? You write stuff, and we'll put it in the right place for you. So this is build time compiler magic. So looking at a script setup, notice that we don't export a default thing. We don't have an option. We don't have like an object that we're doing stuff in. We just go script setup, and then we have const props equals define props, and then we do our normal generic prop definition here. So the script setup is the thing that's causing the magic here, because setup is once again a compiler directive to say, hey, we're doing something different, treat this differently. And then define props is a compiler macro. Now, a compiler macro is not a function. This is not a JavaScript function. It looks like a JavaScript function. It is not a JavaScript function. However, I'm going to use the language of JavaScript functions to talk about this because I don't have the right words to say something else. What's happening here is that we will define, when we say define props, we pass in an argument to it saying, here are the props that I want to define. What the compiler is doing is that it will take this code here, and it'll say, oh, define props, these are props. Let me take what's that argument and put it into an object in the correct place where props are defined. So when you type in this code, the actual code that gets compiled out is this. So you can see here, once again, we have that props property with the array of things that we defined. And then it is assigning the props that are coming into the setup function as props, so that as we do our logic within that function, it'll do all this stuff. And then it returns a render function that doesn't do anything, and finds some extra metadata about the thing, and then exports our component. So this is, when we're talking about script setup, this is what it's doing, is that it's just like moving code around. It lets you sort of define things, and then it'll be like, I know where this goes, and put it in the right place. And so yeah, we have our props there, and then the setup, and then that. I really need to look at my slide stuff a little bit more. All right. So now that we understand that there is compiler magic happening here, right? This is all build time stuff to make it work at runtime. The next example will look very familiar, hopefully. You've seen this before, right? We saw about 10 minutes ago. Once again, we can do everything that we can do normally with defining props the same way in our define props macro. Once again, you can do all of your defaults, you can pass functions, what have you. You can do your validators how you want to. And TypeScript, exact same thing, right? It is the exact same syntax for TypeScript. Super easy, super straightforward. We've already gone over all of this. It's just now you're putting it in a slightly different place. That's it. So you've seen all of this before. This is boring because I've already explained all of this. So let's talk about TypeScript. Who here likes TypeScript? I'm on the fence. I'm really deep into it. I'm not entirely sure that I like it. But because we're using TypeScript, right? TypeScript happens at build time. There is a step where you go through and it has to parse out all the TypeScript and then remove all of the types, right? So the core team was like, hey, what if we just hook into that and we go, let's add to our compiler macro. Like, what type is it using? So there's another way you can use define props. So previously, we were doing stuff like this, right? We'd import prop type, and we would have our options definition that we were using, and then we'd have to do like model value with a string or a number, and then a name with a string, and then an options with an object and a prop type, blah, 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 right? Very, very like similar to what we've already done. So they were like, what if we just use the type definition? So what this does, you'll notice here, I no longer am importing prop type. What's happening in here, though, is really interesting, is that with define props at the end, I'm not calling that compiler macro. I'm passing in a type definition, right? It's using a generic, and I'm passing in a type definition. And then at the end of it, on line 9, you can see there aren't any arguments passed to it. So what Vue is doing is that it's taking our type definition and generating all of the code that we had previously been handwriting, just using the type definition. So now we have our type definition as being model is either a string or a number, right, in our very TypeScripty way. Name is a string, and options is our options object. I'm not having to use prop type anymore, and it automatically knows, like, hey, it's supposed to be of this type. So this is a bit more compact. This is great, right? This is really beautiful. I really love this. Now, what this compiles down to, I'm going to show you 2 examples here. When we pass in a type definition, what this actually compiles to, I find this interesting, is this. So this is in development mode. When you're doing a dev build, when you're running like, npm run dev or whatever, and it's doing its little vite dev server, maybe webpack dev server, and it's running everything. This is what it's going to generate. So you'll notice with the props, it gives you the types, and it tells you that everything's required. Let's go back a second. Hold on, let's look at this. Everything is required because everything is required on the props type, right? None of them are optional. They're all mandatory. So you have to pass all of these in. We can see that it's a string number, it's required. Name is also required, and it's of type string. Options is of type object with a required true. And so that's not entirely what we want. And what's interesting also about this is that in a production build, what this does is that it essentially gives you a generic prop definition. It doesn't actually do any of the type checking. So once again, this is all stuff that's happening at build time or in development, but not in production. You don't get any of that runtime type hinting in production. So be careful. If you really need to do checks, do your own checks in your setup function to be like, is this the thing I'm expecting it to be? So going back to this example, when we were talking before, name and options should have a default, right? We want to be able to make them optional. We want to be able to give them a default. So let's make this a little bit more succinct so that we can do things with it a little bit easier. We'll go ahead and move our props definition into its own type, and then we'll just say define props, and it'll use our type definition. Great. And then we can now call with defaults, which is another compiler macro, right? Remember, build time. This is all happening at build time. This is all a way to tell the compiler, hey, I need to provide some default values for this. And with that, we're going to have define props as the first argument. So our call to define props with the type indicated. And then we're going to pass an object. So this is an object literal. You cannot pass a function here. It has to be a literal object. And you pass in the default values that you want. And so name is going to be an empty string. Once again, options is going to be a function that returns an object. Cool? Makes sense? Do all the highlighting. Cool. And so now our defaults are in there. Great. Model value is still required. And name is now optional. So we can make that an optional type, and we're providing a default for it. Same thing with options. Options is optional now, and we're providing a default value for it. And so there we go. Magic. Yay, magic. I love this. This is actually my current favorite way of doing things. Like, I'm not super in love with TypeScript, but this is really nice. I really like this. So let's say we're making a bunch of input components. Who here has had to like make a text input and a number input and like a date input? A few of you, yeah. They all need a label. They all need a name. They all need, right? Like there are things that they all share that like are the same across all of them. So we need a way to be able to like define it once, reuse it in multiple places. So let's define some base properties, right? We're going to have a bunch of inputs. They're all going to have a name and an options object, we'll say. And so we define our options, we define our name, and then we're going to have a base set of defaults for these. Now, base defaults is going to be an object literal. Once again, not a function, has to be a literal. So the way that we can now use these, you see I'm exporting base props as an interface, and then our base props default is an actual literal const object with the default properties that we want. I can now, in a component, import the base props type and our defaults, and I can extend the base props with a props interface that we're going to use locally. We define our model value to be whatever it is that we need to do. And I'm not doing generics here because the compiler does not handle generics. So this is why we're doing it this way. I know a lot of you are screaming like, just put a generic in. No, it doesn't work. Got to do it this way. For now, that might change in the future, but this is spent a couple hours on this one. It was a fun day. So we're defining our model value. We're then able to pass that interface that extends another type as our prop definition. And then we can spread that object literal that we're importing, we can spread that into our defaults so that we can then also define, like if we added in more optional things that we want to define defaults for, we can then add those as additional properties, but those base ones get spread in. And there you go. So that is it. Oh gosh, right, highlighting, sorry. I keep pointing at things and then like I have it all set up to highlight them and then I don't do it. It's great. So we can spread the base props. Cool. Now, I mentioned before that model value is a special prop name, right? And I've been dealing with that so far, and I haven't really covered the need to like write an emits section. So let's talk about model value a little bit. Model value is complicated. As I mentioned before, you have to define a prop called model value. You then have to define an event called update:model value. You're then going to have to deal with like prop coming in, and then when something changes, deleting that thing, right? Very complicated. Wouldn't it be great if we could call one thing and get all of that as like a computed value or something, right? Wouldn't that be nice? Good news. We can. So this is our current, weird implementation of a bunch of props. We can simplify this a little bit by moving base props. We don't need to define our props type because we're not really doing anything with it. And we now call a thing called define model. Now, I believe define model is a compiler macro. I'm now doubting myself, but I believe that it's a compiler macro. So what this does is that it returns essentially a fancy computed value that when you get the value, it'll pull the model value prop. When you set the value, right, because we're dealing with refs, so it'd be model.value equals blah, it will then emit an event up for you and keep everything in sync. And so it'll do all of the type definitions and stuff like this. But this is, once again, yet another way to define a prop. Whoa. And I don't think I cover it in here because I realized I had way too many slides already. We're only slightly past halfway through. That you can also do this with any named prop. If you pass in a string as the first argument to define model, you can say, hey, give me something that is bound with an update event. So you could be like name, you can do define model parentheses name, and then all of comma object, all of the options that you want. So define model, very handy, very useful. However, this is not very TypeScripty, right? So, you know, core teams are very into TypeScript, so they made it very TypeScripty. So you can just do, hey, define model, string number, there you go, done. It'll do the typing for you. So when you do model.value, so we can define our model, pass in a type, and then model.value equals 0, it will then emit up an event that says, hey, the new value is 0, and it'll do that sort of synchronization thing. Make sense? Everybody follow that? Any questions? Excellent. Who here, I'm going to say a dirty word, who here likes React? Don't lie. Don't lie, Homer. All right. So good. We can kind of, I know it's being recorded, but we can kind of shit talk them a little bit. So, did you know, and I've covered this in other talks, did you know you can write JSX for Vue? You can. Been able to do it since 2016. Very important. Anyway, so guess what? We can do some other weird fun stuff this way. Let's get into it. This is a JSX component. And you'll notice I'm using the define component function. Define component is a runtime function. It's not a compiler directive. This is something that you can use in the browser. It'll help you with the extra little weird bits of defining a component. So define component is a function that is exported from the Vue package. We can pass in as our first argument our setup function. So that takes in a props object. And then we can return the render function. Because setup runs once, and so we need something that consistently runs over and over and over. And so our setup function will be returned, or our render function will be returned from the setup function, and that's where the JSX part lives. And so within our JSX, we're referring to props.propName, and then the second argument of define component is the ability to pass in your props, your emits, your whatever, right? So you pass in an object with all of your options for a thing. Now, could we do this as like one object with a setup, with an actual setup function, and that returns a render function, and then like, right? Like there are multiple ways of doing this. I'm not gonna go through all of them, but this is a pretty straightforward one that like if you show it to a React person, they'll go like, I get it. And so once again, we have sort of all of the ways. Every time that I show you a different way of doing things, that counts towards the 20. So once again, we can kind of do it, you know, props. It's the same thing that we've seen before. You can do all of this. This does not work in a browser by itself, right? Because of JSX. JSX does not work in a browser. You still need a compile step for it. But if you were to hand write a render function for some reason, please don't. You could do it this way to make it very succinct and compact and write it like in a JavaScript file, and it would work. So we go through all of the various things that you can do to like do the things, right? Cool, so I promised you Unhinged. So I have come up with a thing that I'm calling use magic props. Please don't use this. Which kind of is a weird idea where I was like, what if you could define your props at setup as a reactive value, that when that reactive value updates, the props object would update. Because I'm a horrible person and you should never do this. So let's talk about $adders. Now, we've been talking about props, right? In React, anything that you pass as a property, as a value on a element or whatever, is considered a prop, right? It just automatically passes through as a prop into like their props object, and then you can deconstruct that. In Vue, you have to specifically define your props so that they gain the reactivity of the system. But what happens if you put something that's not defined as a prop? Well, it goes into a thing called $adders. $adders has everything else, right? If it's not a prop, it's in $adders. Which, fun fact, we'll get into in a minute. But it's always passed as a parent, from the parent as extra attributes to a component. So if I do like a prop that has a message prop, right? And then I pass class is going to be in $adders. Vue has a way to automatically put that on the root element of component. So if you have a component that only has one root element, right? You put like a div that surrounds everything. The adders will automatically get applied to that element. If you put two divs next to each other, Vue's going to be like, I don't know what to do. I'm not going to do anything. And you'll have to manually do it. The way that you manually do it is that you can say, hey, this element, we're going to v-bind equals $adders. And it'll say, okay, cool. Anything else that comes into this component will go on this specific element. There you go. So this is $adders. And we're going to hack the system a little bit and use $adders to make our own props during setup. This is very exciting. So imagine with me, if you will, we had a component defined like this. So script setup, const props def is equal to a ref with an empty array, right? That's going to be our props definition. We then import use magic props, and we pass it our props definition. So it can be a reactive value. It doesn't have to be a reactive value, but it's really cool. It's a reactive value. And then we're going to, after we've defined props, add one. We're going to add message as our props, right? So now message is a prop. Now this by itself will not work. I have not yet quite figured out how to get into the system enough to hack it in an effective manner to make this work. I will one day. But for now, what we have to do is that in our template, we have to wrap everything in a component called magic props. And that's where the magic happens. So a demo of this, I've made this code pen, and as my coworker Abby would say, Alex, I'm not looking at another code pen. In here, we have we're using, I can show you the JavaScript for this. We have a Vue component that the template is wrapped in magic props. And we have buttons. One button is going to add the class as a prop. One button is going to remove the class name as a prop. And then I'm just showing you the message prop. I'm also showing you the prop definition, and I'm showing you the actual props object. And then within here, we're doing props def. I'm passing in an array with message. I'm doing use magic props is equal to props def, right? We're passing that in. And that's it. This is the whole component. So when we're looking at the real world example of this, I can type things in. You can see that message updates inside of that component. When I add the class to our props definition, the text changes because class is no longer an attribute, so it's not applied to the wrapper that's going around everything in the component, so the styling changes. And we get a new prop called class with subtitle as the value. And if I remove that class, all of the styling goes back to the way that it was before, because we are dynamically creating a props object. This is black magic. This is dark magic. Don't do this, please. Oh, you can't see any of this. Oh my gosh, this is why I have a second monitor. I'm sorry, y'all. Okay, let's look. Yeah, I know. All right, so in the JavaScript, we have a view component. Here we go. With magic props, right? I have two buttons. One is adding a thing, one is setting a thing. When I mess up like that, just yell at me. It's fine. I'm fine being heckled. We have another button, and it is going to remove the class property. We're displaying our props.message. We're displaying the props definition. We're displaying the props object itself. And all of this is, once again, wrapped in a magic props. I'm defining prop stuff as a ref. I'm passing it to use magic props. And all of that gets returned in our setup function. Cool? Everybody follow that? So that then when I start typing in here, it all updates. And when I hit the add class, styling changes because class is now a prop. But when I remove class from our props definition, it stops being a prop. So there you go. This is magic props. Please, for the love of God, don't use this. So why would you want to do this? You don't. I have been trying for several months now to create something so unhinged that it's just like, oh yeah, so this like goes into the definition at runtime and replaces the render function with something else. Like that's the level of like weirdness that I was trying to get into to make this work. This is the closest that I could get. And if you're interested in the code, I will be glad to show you, but I'm not showing it here. So that is my talk. You now have an abundance of ways to define props in your Pocket, and hopefully some of them will be useful to you. Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
What's your favorite way of defining props?
The TypeScript way with defaults is, it's really growing on me. It's really growing on me. Like, if you're in a TypeScript code base, highly recommend that. Script setup is also growing on me quite a bit. But like, honestly, if you're just like prototyping something, just tossing it in an array with some strings, super nice. I really like that. No, good question. Other questions? Anybody? I am so brilliant. I've just absolutely transferred all of my knowledge to everyone's heads. I love it when that happens. Yes?
So you mentioned React. So if someone comes to you and says, why do you like Vue over React?
Oh, okay. Now we're getting, all right, getting spicy takes. All right, so the question was, why, if someone likes React and they come to me and they go, why do you like Vue over React? This is being recorded. So the short version is, and there's a very angry thread about this for a bit. The short version is React is bloated, part one. Another reason is the reactivity model is stupid. React team, reactivity model is stupid in React. There are ways that the JavaScript ecosystem is agreeing on how reactivity should work to the point where it can become a standard in JavaScript. And if you look at the proposal for Signals is the proposal for this. If you look at the proposal for Signals, you have Angular team members, you have Vue team members, you have Quick team members, you have Solid team members, you have Svelte team members, Astro team members. All of these frameworks have agreed, yeah, this is the implementation. There is one notably missing from that list.
How often does React change its stuff compared to Vue?
I will let you know when React 19 comes out, and that'll give you a better time frame. Right now, I think we're sitting at like 2.5 years since their last major release that's stable. And they like to just change things randomly. They proposed a way of doing suspended components where you can be like, this is going to be loading promises dynamically, so like don't render it until all of that's done. And React 19, they were just like, we're completely changing how that works. And everybody was like, and so they've had to rewrite that back to account for it.
Continuity question, right? What's the continuity like if I develop a large amount of code in React? What kind of maintenance comes to just preserve continuity?
That's a great question. And when React 19 comes out, I'm sure there will be several articles about that, but I don't have a good answer for that, unfortunately. I know that they do have a lot of good backwards compatibility most of the time. They'll support several versions back, but I know that they start deprecating like certain features after a certain point. But I do know a lot of people who are like, oh, we're still using like class components. And so we can't use the newer stuff until we rewrite everything. So React is sometimes, yeah. It's good though, because you can write a code base for 3 years and not have a big release that changes anything. So that's great. Yeah, so I have very strong opinions about React. It is not my favorite. If you're using React, it's fine. There you go. There's the caveat. I have it on video. If you're using React, it's fine. Don't rewrite everything in something else. If you're building something new, try something else. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't know if it's a question or maybe just a comment, but Patterson kind of auxiliary to this. You reminded me of it when you look at like sharing props and stuff. Is something helpful that I found. Like I like using enums a lot in TypeScript. I just love them. But you cannot export enum from your SFC if you're going to use it in. Yeah, because obviously, like your IDE does not know what's going on because it's a compiler situation, and it doesn't understand SFCs enough to figure it all out. And so it is totally kosher for you guys to add a script, two script tags in your SFC. One that's not set up syntax macro, and you can export your enums up there. And then you do your second script tag with the setup. And this is the paradigm that I think is helpful, but I don't know if everybody knows that. But you kind of reminded me.
Yeah, no, I like this. So the comment is that if you can't export an enum from a script setup tag, but if you add an additional script tag at the top that's TypeScript, you can export enums from a Vue component. I believe you can also do, you've already made this talk invalidated. I believe you can also do an export default from a script tag and then have a script setup tag, and you can do your props definition in that default export. I'm gonna have to add more slides. But yeah, no, that's a good point. Good call out on that. That is I'll have to mention that somewhere. So cool. Anybody else? Good. Excellent. Well, thank you all for coming to my talk.